What happens when a child's innocent joy becomes a target for prejudice? When a simple family trip transforms into a battleground against systemic racism? And what occurs when those who discriminate discover they've targeted the family of the very person who holds their livelihood in his hands? This is the extraordinary true story of 8-year-old Noel Ridge, whose first international flight became a defining moment in the fight against aviation discrimination. It's a story about a little girl in a pink bunny hoodie, clutching her favorite coloring book, who unknowingly became the catalyst for industry-wide change. But more than that, it's a story about her father, Malcolm Ridge, who watched his daughter's excitement turn to confusion and fear at the hands of someone who saw her skin color before her humanity. Picture this: a bright-eyed child settling into her first-class seat, marveling at the luxury around her, sketching unicorns and sipping sparkling water. Now imagine that same child being treated as a threat, blamed for accidents she didn't cause, and ultimately having police called on her for simply existing while black. This is the reality that too many black children face when traveling. A reality that extends far beyond individual prejudice to reveal systemic issues within the aviation industry. In recent years, we've witnessed disturbing patterns of racial profiling in aviation. Black parents accused of trafficking their own children, families removed from flights over fabricated complaints, and children subjected to discriminatory treatment that would never be tolerated if directed at white passengers. The case of musician David Ryan Harris, falsely accused of trafficking his biracial children, and Mary McCarthy's lawsuit against Southwest Airlines for similar accusations, demonstrate that these incidents are not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of institutional bias. But this story is different. This is about what happens when racism meets accountability, when prejudice encounters power, and when one man's quiet authority transforms a moment of injustice into a movement for change. This is the story of how a father's love for his daughter became a catalyst for revolution. Malcolm Ridge had never intended to become a symbol of corporate accountability or a champion of civil rights. His journey to the helm of Vidian Holdings, the parent company of Aurelia Air, had been marked by quiet excellence rather than public activism. Born in Atlanta to a family of educators, he had learned early that success for black men in corporate America required not just competence, but exceptional performance paired with strategic invisibility. His academic credentials were impeccable. A mathematics degree from Morehouse College, an MBA from Wharton, and a PhD in organizational psychology from Yale. He had spent his early career in consulting, specializing in infrastructure equity and organizational transformation. His work had taken him around the world, analyzing complex systems and identifying the subtle mechanisms that perpetuated inequality within large organizations. Malcolm's approach to leadership was characterized by what his colleagues called quiet power, the ability to command respect through competence rather than charisma, to create change through systematic action rather than dramatic gestures. He had joined Vidian Holdings 5 years earlier as a senior vice president, tasked with overseeing the company's transportation portfolio. His success in streamlining operations and improving customer satisfaction had earned him rapid promotions, culminating in his recent appointment as CEO. The aviation industry that Malcolm had inherited was one struggling with a legacy of discrimination that extended far beyond individual incidents. Studies had shown that black passengers were more likely to be subjected to additional security screening, questioned about their seat assignments, and treated with suspicion by airline staff. The phenomenon of flying while black had become a recognized form of discrimination, with numerous high-profile cases making headlines. Children were particularly vulnerable to these biases. Research had documented how black children were more likely to be perceived as older, more threatening, and less innocent than their white counterparts. In the aviation context, this translated to increased scrutiny harsher treatment, and the kind of discriminatory policing that Malcolm was determined to eliminate from his company's operations. Malcolm's daughter, Noelle, represented everything he was fighting to protect. At 8 years old, she embodied the kind of joy and curiosity that should be celebrated, not suppressed. She excelled in school, loved art and animals, and had been counting down the days to her first international flight. Her excitement about the trip to Copenhagen, where Malcolm was scheduled to deliver a keynote address at a global aviation conference, had been infectious. The irony was not lost on Malcolm that he was traveling to speak about creating more inclusive aviation practices while his own daughter was experiencing the very discrimination he had spent years studying and working to eliminate. His presentation, titled Beyond Compliance, Creating Cultures of Authentic Inclusion, was based on extensive research into the psychological and structural factors that perpetuated bias in service industries. The broader context of their travel was significant. This was 2023, a year that had seen multiple high-profile cases of aviation discrimination making national headlines. The settlement of American Airlines' discrimination lawsuit filed by 3 black men who had been removed from a flight over false complaints about body odor had cost the airline millions and attracted federal scrutiny. The case of David Ryan Harris, the black musician falsely accused of trafficking his own biracial children, had sparked conversations about the intersection of racial bias and family profiling in aviation. Malcolm was acutely aware of these patterns, having studied them extensively in his professional capacity. He knew that black families were disproportionately likely to be questioned about their relationships, their right to be in premium cabins, and their intentions when traveling. He had implemented training programs designed to address these biases, but he also understood that changing deep-seated attitudes required more than policy changes, required cultural transformation. The flight to Copenhagen was meant to be a celebration of father sharing his professional success with his daughter, introducing her to the world of international travel, and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Malcolm had specifically chosen to fly on one of his own company's airlines, both to support the business and to demonstrate his confidence in the reforms he had implemented. What he hadn't anticipated was that his daughter would become a test case for those very reforms, and that the flight would transform from a family vacation into a defining moment in his career and the aviation industry's ongoing struggle with racial bias. The pink bunny hoodie that Noelle had chosen for the journey would become a symbol of childhood innocence confronting institutional prejudice, and Malcolm's response would demonstrate the power of quiet authority in the face of systemic discrimination. Morning of March 15th began with the kind of excitement that only a child experiencing her first international flight could generate. Noelle Ridge had been awake since 5 a.m., carefully packing her carry-on bag with her favorite coloring books, a new set of glitter pens, and the fuzzy unicorn backpack that had been her father's gift for the occasion. Her pink hoodie with bunny ears had been her own choice, a whimsical touch that made her feel both comfortable and special for the adventure ahead. As they arrived at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Malcolm watched his daughter's wonder at the size of the terminal, the bustle of travelers, and the massive aircraft visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had specifically booked first-class seats on Aurelia Air Flight 847 to Copenhagen, wanting to give Noelle the full experience of international travel, while also conducting an informal assessment of his company's service standards. The boarding process proceeded smoothly, with Noelle clutching her boarding pass like a treasured artifact and carefully checking the seat numbers as they made their way down the jet bridge. As they settled into seats 3A and 3B, Malcolm noticed the flight attendant assigned to their section, Dedra Langston, a 20-year veteran of the airline, whose service record he would later discover contained subtle patterns of complaints from minority passengers. The first sign of trouble came during the pre-flight beverage service. While other first-class passengers were offered a choice of champagne, orange juice, or sparkling water, Dedra's approach to Noelle was noticeably different. Rather than the warm smile and gentle tone she had used with the white child in seat 2A, her demeanor toward Noelle was cool and professional, bordering on suspicious. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Dedra asked, scrutinizing Noelle's boarding pass with unnecessary intensity. First class can be confusing for young travelers. Malcolm's trained eye caught the microaggression immediately. The implication that an 8-year-old black girl might not belong in first class was subtle but unmistakable. He intervened gently. "She's in the correct seat. We're traveling together to Copenhagen." Dedra's response was professionally polite, but carried an undercurrent of skepticism. "Of course. I'll need to verify this with the manifest." She made a show of checking her tablet, despite having already confirmed their seating during the boarding process. "Yes, everything appears to be in order." The pattern of differential treatment continued throughout the flight. When Noelle requested sparkling water, Dedra delivered it with a series of warnings about being careful with the glass and not spilling on the expensive upholstery. When she brought Noelle's meal, the tray was placed with deliberate precision, accompanied by commentary about the importance of keeping the area clean. That the breaking point came 2 hours into the flight, during what appeared to be a routine service. Interaction. Dedra approached with a small tray containing salt and pepper shakers, ostensibly to refill the condiments at each seat. As she reached Noelle's tray table, she made a subtle adjustment to her grip that caused the salt shaker to tip, spilling its contents across the table and onto the floor dot. The reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "We need to be more careful," Dedra announced, her voice carrying clearly throughout the first-class cabin. "These spills are difficult to clean and can damage the aircraft's interior." Noelle looked up from her coloring book, confusion and hurt evident in her eyes. "I didn't touch it," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nevertheless, we need to take responsibility for our actions," Dedra replied, her tone suggesting that the 8-year-old was somehow culpable for the accident she had clearly caused herself. Malcolm had witnessed enough. Rising from his seat, he approached Dedra with the controlled composure that had served him well in countless corporate negotiations. "Excuse me, but I observed what happened. You tipped the salt shaker when you placed the tray. My daughter was not responsible for that spill." Dedra's response revealed the depth of her assumptions about the family's status and her own authority. "Sir, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know how to handle service items. Perhaps if you had been supervising your daughter more closely, this wouldn't have happened." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The implication that Malcolm was somehow negligent as a father, combined with the suggestion that his daughter required unusual supervision simply because of her race, represented exactly the kind of bias that his professional work had been designed to eliminate. "I need to speak with your supervisor," Malcolm said, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Dedra's laugh was short and dismissive. "That won't be necessary. I handle these situations routinely. However, if you continue to be disruptive, I may need to report this incident to the captain." The threat was clear. In the post-9/11's aviation environment, any passenger labeled as disruptive faced serious consequences, including potential removal from the flight and placement on no-fly lists. Dedra was using the security apparatus of the airline industry as a weapon against a family whose only transgression was refusing to accept discriminatory treatment. Malcolm's response was measured but firm. "I am asking you to stop creating problems for my daughter and to treat her with the same respect you show other passengers. If you continue this behavior, I will indeed escalate this to your supervisor." The confrontation attracted the attention of other passengers, several of whom had witnessed the salt shaker incident and Dedra's differential treatment of the family. A woman in seat 2C discreetly began recording the interaction on her phone. Recognizing that she was witnessing something significant, Dedra's final escalation came when she retreated to the galley and used the aircraft's communication system to contact the flight deck. Her message to the captain was a masterpiece of manipulative reporting. A disruptive passenger in first class was creating safety concerns, making unreasonable demands, and potentially threatening crew members. The captain's response was swift and decisive. Following standard protocol for in-flight security concerns, he contacted air traffic control and requested that law enforcement meet the aircraft upon arrival in Copenhagen. The decision to involve police transformed what should have been a routine service complaint into a potential criminal matter. As the flight continued, Malcolm noticed the subtle changes in the cabin atmosphere. Other passengers were now aware that police would be boarding the aircraft, and their glances toward his family carried mixtures of curiosity, sympathy, and concern. Noelle, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, had stopped coloring and was looking anxiously between her father and the flight attendant. The final hours of the flight passed in an atmosphere of barely contained tension. Dedra continued her duties with exaggerated professionalism, while Malcolm maintained his composure despite the growing realization that his daughter's first international flight was becoming a trauma rather than a celebration. As the aircraft began its descent into Copenhagen, Malcolm made a decision that would transform the incident from a family crisis into a corporate reckoning. Rather than simply defending himself against whatever charges Dedra had fabricated, he would use his position and authority to ensure that no other family would face similar treatment. The man who had boarded the flight as a father taking his daughter on vacation was preparing to disembark as a CEO determined to transform an entire industry's approach to racial bias. The quiet power that had characterized his leadership style was about to be tested in the most personal way possible, and the aviation industry would never be the same. The descent into Copenhagen Kastrup Airport was marked by a palpable tension that had nothing to do with turbulence. Malcolm watched his daughter's excitement about her first international landing give way to anxiety as she sensed the strange atmosphere in the cabin. Other passengers were stealing glances at their row, and the flight attendant's behavior had become increasingly theatrical, a performance designed to reinforce whatever narrative she had constructed about the disruptive family in first class. Malcolm's mind was working on multiple levels. As a father, he was focused on protecting his daughter from the psychological impact of what was unfolding. As a CEO, he was analyzing the systemic failures that had allowed this situation to develop. And as a black man who had spent his entire career navigating institutional racism, he was preparing for the confrontation that awaited them on the ground. The landing was smooth, but the announcement that followed was anything but routine. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Copenhagen Kastrup Airport. Please remain seated while we complete some arrival procedures. Passengers in rows 1 through 3, please remain in your seats until further notice. The targeting was unmistakable. The announcement effectively singled out the area where Malcolm and Noelle were seated, marking them as subjects of whatever investigation Dedra had initiated. The other first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably, clearly understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. As the aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate, Malcolm could see through the window what awaited them. Copenhagen. Airport police vehicles were positioned near the jet bridge, and several uniformed officers were visible on the tarmac. The sight of law enforcement prepared to board the aircraft created a surreal juxtaposition. They were ostensibly there to investigate an 8-year-old girl and her father for the crime of refusing to accept discriminatory treatment. Malcolm leaned over to Noelle, speaking softly but clearly. "Sweetie, there might be some people who want to talk to us when we get off the plane. They're just doing their job, and everything is going to be fine. Do you understand?" Noelle nodded, her eyes wide with the kind of trust that only a child can have in her father's ability to protect her from the world's complexities. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. Some people just made a mistake, and we're going to help them understand what really happened." The police officers boarded the aircraft with professional efficiency, their presence immediately commanding attention from every passenger. The lead officer, Inspector Henrik Larsson, approached Malcolm's row with a kind of measured caution that suggested he was taking the situation seriously, while also maintaining an open mind about what he might encounter. "Mr. Ridge? I'm Inspector Larsson with Copenhagen Airport Police. I understand there was some kind of incident during the flight. Would you be willing to speak with us?" Malcolm's response was calm and cooperative, but it carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being in authority. "Of course, Inspector. I'd be happy to discuss what happened. However, I want to make sure my daughter is comfortable during our conversation." The inspector's demeanor shifted slightly as he registered Malcolm's composed authority and articulate response. This was clearly not the disruptive passenger he had been expecting to encounter. "Certainly. We can speak in the VIP lounge, if that would be more appropriate for your daughter." As they prepared to disembark, Malcolm made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of the incident. Rather than simply defending himself reactively, he would take control of the narrative by revealing information that would transform everyone's understanding of the situation. "Inspector, before we proceed, I think there's something you should know. My name is Malcolm Ridge, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Vidian Holdings, the parent company of Aurelia Air. This is my daughter Noelle, and we were traveling on one of my company's aircraft when this incident occurred." The revelation had an immediate and profound impact. Inspector Larsson's expression shifted from professional caution to something approaching astonishment. The other officers exchanged glances, clearly processing the implications of what they had just heard. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby expecting to provide her version of events, went pale as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. "I see," Inspector Larsson said slowly. "That certainly adds context to the situation. Perhaps we should conduct this conversation in a more private setting." The movement to the VIP lounge was swift and discreet, but not before several passengers had overheard Malcolm's revelation. The woman in seat 2C, who had been recording the interaction, now understood that she had documented something far more significant than a routine passenger dispute. Her video, which would later go viral on social media, captured the moment when a flight attendant's discriminatory behavior collided with corporate accountability. In the VIP lounge, Malcolm methodically laid out the facts of the incident. He had been taking detailed notes throughout the flight, a habit developed during his consulting years, and his account was precise, chronological, and devastating in its clarity. He described the differential treatment his daughter had received, the deliberately caused spill, the false accusations, and the inappropriate escalation to law enforcement. "Inspector, I want to be clear about something," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him successful in corporate boardrooms. "This is not about individual vengeance or corporate retaliation. This is about a systemic problem that affects countless families who don't have the resources or platform to demand accountability." He paused, looking at his daughter, who was quietly coloring in the corner of the lounge, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the adult conversation taking place around her. "My daughter experienced racism today. She was treated as a threat, blamed for actions she didn't commit, and subjected to discriminatory policing simply because of her skin color. The fact that I happen to be in a position of authority doesn't change the fundamental injustice of what occurred." Inspector Larsson, who had been taking detailed notes throughout Malcolm's account, looked up with the expression of professional resolve. "Mr. Ridge, based on what you've told us and what we've observed, it appears that this incident was handled inappropriately from the beginning. We'll be conducting a full investigation, but I want to assure you that no charges will be filed against you or your daughter." Malcolm's response revealed the depth of his strategic thinking. "Inspector, I appreciate your professionalism, but I'm not interested in simply clearing our names. I want to ensure that this incident becomes a catalyst for meaningful change. I'll be initiating a comprehensive investigation into how this happened, and I intend to use whatever resources are necessary to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future." The inspector nodded slowly, recognizing that he was witnessing something unprecedented, a case where institutional racism had targeted not just any family, but the family of the person with the power to transform the entire system that had enabled the discrimination. As they prepared to leave the airport, Malcolm made one final decision that would determine the scope and impact of what was to come. Rather than handling the incident quietly through corporate channels, he would make it public, using his platform to shine a light on the broader patterns of discrimination that affected countless families who lacked his resources and influence. The struggle had begun, but Malcolm Ridge had just transformed it from a defensive battle into a strategic campaign for systemic change. The transformation of the incident from a family crisis into a corporate reckoning began with a single phone call Malcolm made from a Copenhagen airport VIP lounge. As Noel colored quietly in the corner, he contacted Sarah Chun, Vidian Holdings' chief communications officer, and delivered instructions that would set in motion the most comprehensive response to aviation discrimination in the industry's history. "Sarah, I need you to convene an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him a successful CEO. "We're going to be addressing a discrimination incident that occurred on one of our aircraft, and I want to ensure that our response sets a new standard for corporate accountability." What followed was a masterclass in strategic crisis management. Rather than attempting to minimize the incident or protect the company's reputation through traditional damage control, Malcolm chose full transparency and unprecedented accountability. He understood that the moment called for leadership that went beyond corporate self-interest to address the fundamental issues of justice and human dignity. The emergency board meeting, conducted via secure video conference while Malcolm was still in Copenhagen, was unlike any in the company's history. Malcolm presented the facts of the incident with forensic precision, supplemented by the passenger-recorded video that had already begun circulating on social media. The board members, initially concerned about potential legal and financial ramifications, quickly realized that they were witnessing something that transcended typical corporate challenges. "This is not just about one flight attendant's poor judgment," Malcolm explained to the board. "This is about the systematic failures in our training, oversight, and culture that allowed this incident to occur. We have a choice. We can respond defensively and hope this blows over, or we can use this moment to transform our industry's approach to discrimination." The board's unanimous support for Malcolm's comprehensive response plan was itself a reflection of the cultural transformation he had been quietly building within the company. His years of systematic work to diversify leadership, implement bias training, and create accountability mechanisms had created an organization capable of facing its failures honestly and responding with integrity. The public revelation of Malcolm's identity and his response to the incident created a media firestorm that extended far beyond the aviation industry. The image of an 8-year-old black girl in a pink bunny hoodie being subjected to discriminatory treatment, followed by the revelation that her father was the CEO of the airline's parent company, captured public attention in a way that abstract discussions of corporate bias never could. The flight attendant, Dedra Langston, found herself at the center of a global conversation about racism in aviation. Her 20-year career, which had included subtle patterns of discriminatory behavior toward minority passengers, was suddenly subject to intense scrutiny. The investigation that followed revealed a troubling history of complaints that had been minimized or ignored by previous management. Malcolm's decision to make the incident public was strategic and principled. He understood that private accountability would never create the systemic change necessary to protect other families from similar treatment. By using his platform to shine a light on the problem, he was forcing not just his own company, but the entire aviation industry to confront its discriminatory practices. The response from other airlines was swift and revealing. Some competitors attempted to capitalize on Aurelia Air's crisis by positioning themselves as more inclusive alternatives. Others quietly began reviewing their own training programs and incident reports, recognizing that similar problems likely existed within their organizations. But Malcolm's most significant decision was yet to come. During a press conference at Copenhagen Airport, with Noelle standing beside him in her bunny hoodie, he announced the creation of the Noelle Ridge Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to eliminate discrimination in aviation through systematic training, accountability measures, and support for affected families. My daughter should not have to be the CEO's daughter to receive respectful treatment, Malcolm said, his voice carrying across the packed press conference room. Every child, regardless of their race or their parents' position, deserves to travel with dignity and respect. The Noelle Ridge Initiative will ensure that no family faces what we experience today. The initiative represented more than corporate philanthropy. It was a blueprint for industry transformation. The program included mandatory bias training for all employees, independent monitoring of passenger treatment, financial support for families affected by discrimination, and partnerships with civil rights organizations to ensure accountability. Moment that truly defined the climax came when Malcolm, still at the press conference, received the call from the Danish Minister of Transport. The minister, who had been following the incident through media coverage, offered the full support of the Danish government in investigating the incident and implementing reforms to prevent similar occurrences. "Mr. Ridge," the minister said, his voice audible through the speakerphone, "what happened to your daughter represents a failure of basic human decency. Denmark stands ready to support any measures necessary to ensure that such discrimination never occurs again in our airports or airspace." The international dimension of the response elevated the incident from a corporate crisis to a diplomatic matter, with implications that extended far beyond the aviation industry. Malcolm had successfully transformed a moment of personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change, using his position not for personal vindication, but for the protection of countless other families who might face similar treatment. As the press conference concluded, Malcolm knelt down to Noelle's level and spoke softly to her. "Sweetie, do you understand what we're doing here?" Noelle looked up at her father with the wisdom that children sometimes possess. "We're making sure other kids don't get treated like I did?" "That's exactly right, baby. We're making sure this never happens to anyone else." The weeks following the Copenhagen incident witnessed a transformation of the aviation industry's approach to discrimination that exceeded even Malcolm's ambitious goals. The Noelle Ridge Initiative, launched with an initial funding of $50 million, became the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in aviation history, setting new standards that competitors scrambled to match. The immediate consequences for those directly involved were swift and decisive. Dedra Langston was terminated from her position, her 20-year career ending in disgrace as investigators uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been inadequately addressed by previous management. Her pension was forfeited, and she was placed on an industry-wide blacklist that effectively ended her career in aviation. But Malcolm's response extended far beyond individual accountability. The investigation he ordered revealed systemic failures. in hiring, training, and oversight that had allowed discriminatory behavior to flourish for years. The company's entire customer service training program was redesigned with input from civil rights organizations, child psychologists, and cultural competency experts. The Noel Ridge Initiative's impact was felt across the industry. Within 6 months, major airlines had implemented similar programs, driven by a combination of competitive pressure, regulatory scrutiny, and genuine recognition that change was necessary. The Federal Aviation Administration announced new requirements for bias training and incident reporting, while the International Civil Aviation Organization began developing global standards for anti-discrimination measures. The transformation was measurable in concrete terms. Customer satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in the experiences of minority passengers, while the number of discrimination complaints filed with regulatory agencies decreased significantly. More importantly, the cultural shift was evident in the testimonials from families who reported feeling welcomed and respected during their travels. Malcolm's leadership during the crisis earned him recognition as one of the most influential executives of his generation. He was invited to speak at the United Nations about corporate accountability, testified before Congress about discrimination in transportation, and received numerous awards for his commitment to social justice. But he consistently emphasized that the real victory belonged to his daughter and the countless other children who would benefit from the changes they had sparked. The personal impact on the Ridge family was profound and lasting. Noelle, who had initially been traumatized by the incident, gradually came to understand the significance of what had occurred. Her pink bunny hoodie was donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it became part of an exhibit on children's experiences with discrimination. The international dimension of the case continued to resonate. The European Union implemented new anti-discrimination standards for aviation, while countries around the world began reviewing their own policies and procedures. The incident became a case study in business schools and law schools, illustrating how corporate leadership could transform crisis into opportunity for social change. The legal ramifications were equally significant. Multiple lawsuits were filed against airlines for similar discriminatory practices, with plaintiffs citing the Ridge case as precedent for corporate accountability. The settlements in these cases provided compensation for affected families while funding additional anti-discrimination programs. The media coverage of the incident and its aftermath sustained public attention on aviation discrimination for months. The hashtag Noel Ridge Initiative became a rallying cry for families who had experienced similar treatment, while the image of the 8-year-old girl in her bunny hoodie became a symbol of childhood resilience in the face of adult prejudice. Long-term cultural impact was perhaps most evident in the aviation industry's hiring and promotion practices. Airlines began actively recruiting diverse leadership teams, recognizing that representation at all levels was essential for creating truly inclusive environments. The number of minority employees in management positions increased significantly, while customer-facing roles were filled with individuals specifically trained in cultural competency and anti-bias practices. Malcolm's approach to the crisis choosing transparency over defensiveness, accountability over damage control, and systemic change over individual punishment became a model for corporate leadership in addressing discrimination. His decision to use his personal trauma as a catalyst for industry transformation demonstrated the power of principled leadership in creating lasting social change. The Copenhagen incident, which had begun as a family's worst nightmare, ultimately became a triumph of justice and human dignity. The little girl who had been treated as a threat became a symbol of hope, while her father's response proved that corporate power, when wielded with integrity and purpose, could indeed transform systems of oppression into mechanisms for equality. Noel Ridge Initiative continued to expand its reach, eventually establishing programs in over 40 countries and directly impacting the travel experiences of millions of families. The Foundation's work extended beyond aviation to address discrimination in hospitality, transportation, and other service industries, creating a ripple effect that touched countless lives. The story of Noelle Ridge and her father Malcolm offers profound lessons about the nature of discrimination, the power of principled leadership, and the possibility of transformation, even in the most entrenched systems. It demonstrates that racism often manifests in subtle forms: the extra scrutiny, the different tone, the assumption that certain people don't belong in certain spaces. But these seemingly small acts of bias can have devastating psychological impacts, especially on children. Perhaps most importantly, this story reveals the extraordinary power that can be unleashed when this discrimination targets someone with the resources and determination to demand accountability. Malcolm Ridge's response to his daughter's treatment was not driven by personal revenge, but by a deeper understanding that individual incidents reflect systemic problems, requiring systematic solutions. The incident highlights a crucial truth about corporate leadership in the modern era. Executives have both the power and the responsibility to address discrimination wherever they encounter it. Malcolm's decision to use his platform for social change rather than personal vindication demonstrates how business leaders can become agents of transformation in their industries and communities. The story also underscores the importance of protecting our children from the psychological violence of discrimination, while simultaneously preparing them to be advocates for justice. Noelle's journey from victim to symbol of hope illustrates the resilience of young people when they are supported by adults who refuse to accept injustice. For viewers, this story serves as both inspiration and call to action. It reminds us that change is possible when we refuse to accept the status quo and work systematically to create more just and inclusive institutions. It shows that the most powerful response to hatred is not anger, but the patient work of building systems that protect human dignity. The next time you witness discrimination, whether subtle or overt, against children or adults, remember Noelle Ridge in her pink bunny hoodie. Remember that behind every act of bias is a human being deserving of respect and dignity. Remember that change begins with individuals who refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. Most importantly, remember that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simple act of a father protecting his daughter's right to exist in the world without fear, prejudice, or discrimination. In that protection lies the seed of revolution, and in that revolution lies the hope for a more just and equitable future for all our children.